Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. Today we will talk with two guests about what kind of effect the situation in Venezuela is having on Taiwan and carefully block the false narratives around the topic. We will also start an exploration of the infamous 2027 deadline and why it is not what you think it is. And now, without further delay, let's start with today's interview. Of course, in the news this week, more than Taiwan, is Venezuela and the way that President Maduro has been removed by US forces. But this has spilled over to Taiwan with a lot of comment on what it means for our countries. So let's discuss it today with Bryce, Barros and Aurelio Insisa. Gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon.
Morning, good morning.
First and foremost, I would ask you to introduce yourself.
Hi, so it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Julian and Aurelio. My name is Bryce Barros, and I'm an associate fellow with GlobeSec, a Slovakian think tank, but based out of their DC office, and I'm currently living here in Taiwan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aurelio Insisa. I'm Senior Research Fellow at Istituto Affari Internazionali, Institute of International Affairs in Rome, Italy, where I work on China and Asian affairs.
Thank you. So, of course, the reason why also we're talking about Venezuela on a Taiwan-centered program is because there has been a lot of talks around about how this could mean something for Taiwan, and basically that Taiwan is next because China could do to Taiwan what the US has done to Venezuela. Of course, I think the three of us are challenging this idea. So why actually this is not a correct analogy? Maybe, Bryce, can you tell us what you think about this?
Yeah, and happy to. I think it's not a correct analogy for a few different reasons. One, the sophistication of the US removal of Maduro from Caracas is very, very, very complicated. And if you're able to sort of take a step back and look at the operation itself, you can really see some of the lessons that American Special Operations Forces have learned going back to Operation Eagle Claw over 40 years ago to that exact moment, right? So talking about sorties of around 150 aircraft, months on the ground of preparing intelligence, potential sort of backdoors for negotiating the removal and or sort of forfeiting of Nicolas Maduro and his wife as well. There's a lot of different moving parts here. And it's not to say that the PLA or China can't attempt to do that, nor does it mean that they can't try to learn from it. It's just a very, very complicated thing. I don't agree with some of the discourse that you're getting here within Taiwan that there is a deterrence factor to the United States going ahead and carrying out this operation, and that it shows China that it's too complicated for them to try. Given the scale of the operation itself, there are many different parts of the operation that could feed into other sort of things like, fifth or fourth column attacks, future sort of PLA special forces operations, basic intelligence gathering, being able to suppress air defenses, sort of as, the different seed operations that happened before the actual attack and removal of Maduro was carried out. There's many different factors to this. If you take apart everything that's been going on for the last 5-6 months with US forces amassing in the Caribbean, that different parts of that broader operation could be of use to the PLA, but I don't think it's entirely accurate or helpful to say that that automatically means that it would necessarily enable China at all. And it's also worth mentioning and reiterating that Taiwan's already viewed as an internal matter by leadership in Beijing. So anything that happens with an international law sort of implication for Taiwan isn't necessarily what's going to be viewed as a priority within Beijing, because to them, Taiwan isn't an international issue, it's a domestic one.
Thanks a lot. Yes, Bryce. Aurelio, what would be your answer to speculations that this could happen to Taiwan?
Thank you, Julian. I agree with Bryce in the sense that there is, of course, a very specific military dimension has to do with the operational challenges, absolutely. I would add something that Bryce mentioned at the end of his part when he was talking about the legal dimension. And that's absolutely relevant in the sense that it's important in the public debate to stress the extent to which, of course, Taiwan is considered a domestic issue for China. This doesn't mean that there is an international law argument from the Chinese side, in the sense that this is based, of course, on the Chinese interpretations of UN Resolution 2758, but also, of course, on a legal argument in which the Cairo Declaration supersedes, according to Chinese interpretation, the San Francisco Treaty, which ultimately leaves unresolved the status of Taiwan in international law. And these arguments matter because these are the arguments that China uses to essentially prepare already pre-packaged narrative that will allow China to justify its own intervention, for example, within the UN in case of a potential takeover of the island. And something I think is important is that these arguments will most likely be endorsed, I would argue, by most states within the UN because they will prioritize their relations with China and they will endorse this legal argument. But this is only part of the issue. So we mentioned there is a military dimension, there is a legal dimension that for China is domestic, but it also has an international law side. And at the same time, I would stress that, especially from a European perspective, much of the debate about the supposed impact of the events in Venezuela and Taiwan very much stressed, very much rooted into, I would argue, distorted understanding of the contest over Taiwan and the information domain at the global level. I'll try to be a bit clear about it. Much of the discussion focuses on the supposed deterioration of the moral deterrence, a moral high ground that the United States has lost because of Venezuela, and the idea that ultimately Taiwan's security may rest on a supposed clash for the public opinion of the global South. And I'm quite skeptical about it in the sense that I feel that especially among more liberal and progressive voices in Europe, there is still a degree of romanticization of global South public opinions that I think should be dismantled since the event in Ukraine. So the idea is essentially that it's the moral righteousness of Western countries, but especially of the United States in this case, that will ultimately sway public opinions in the global South, that in turn will influence the decision of policymakers in these countries. And I strongly disagree with this approach. I think that ultimately global South countries will take, as it happened with Ukraine, they will take into consideration their own national interests and regime interests. It's important to keep in mind many of the countries we discuss they don't have a liberal democratic system of governance, so there isn't even that kind of connection, clear path between public opinion and policy making, even though they still exist, but in more convoluted and more complex ways. And in this situation, we may tend to overemphasize the importance of the moral high ground in this scenario. Just to conclude, global South countries will think about their own national interests, as it happened with Ukraine. Many of them quietly sided with Russia because that was good for them, for example, the import of food, right? So the import of grain, for energy imports, because they have to balance highly ideologized anti-Western constituencies in their own countries. So there are many reasons for which ultimately international law, the respect of international law by the United States and Western countries and US allies will not be actually an element, a factor in the global narrative battle for Taiwan in case of a potential coercive takeover of the island by China.
That's the key, actually, right? Is that a lot of these comments we hear is that the actions in the United States in Venezuela are damaging international law and rule-based order. Well, we can argue whether it is the case or not, but in any case, it is not relevant to Taiwan because Taiwan has been living outside of these kind of rules anyway for a long time, and this kind of rule of strength, might make right, and coercion has been the situation in which Taiwan is in for decades, actually, isn't it? And also, it's not exactly as if this were the first time that the United States or another great power has been ignoring and bypassing international rules, using force for their own interests. So it's not exactly a turning point or a watershed moment, isn't it?
I agree with you, Julian, and I think it has to this debate, this discussion, it has a lot to do more with a certain professional epistemic communities in the West, within the academia and within think tanks that grew up within with very strong transatlantic relations. They're coming to terms to a fundamental change in U.S. foreign policy. And so this is an argument that, as mentioned earlier, comes, of course, from EU observers, but also within more progressive and liberal environments in the United States. But it tells more about European and American reflections on a changing global order and a changing United States than an actual reflection of the facts on the ground in Taiwan. Indeed, the most prominent, the most relevant voices in this debate, as you could see from social media, but also into legacy media, are not China specialists, but they are global specialists, US specialists, EU specialists. So there's also here an issue of expertise. I would argue that the more you study the issue about Taiwan, the Taiwan issue, the more you're aware of Chinese foreign policy and cross-strait policy, the less you're inclined to have this grand statement, to state this grand statement.
Yes, and that's the whole point of a Taiwanese-centered and Taiwan-based media like ours. Bryce, would you want to comment on this issue as well?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different things going on too. I mean, I do think that if you pay attention to some of the language that's come up since the Trump administration has come, or the second Trump administration has come into power, especially with different sort of statements, interestingly enough, around Justice Mission 2025 from, quote, like-minded democratic partners or what have you of Taiwan. If you look at some of the language, especially from the UK, a couple of other countries that I can't think of off the top of my head specifically. There's a desire not to mention international rules-based order, but to mention norms. There was a really good statement by Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong a few months ago in which she started using norms as the sort of normative way of discussing this, right?
So you're
Partially
gonna
because
have
the Trump
to
administration
clarify, yeah,
haven't.
clarify for us then what is the implication, what is the difference between using norms and using another kind of vocabulary?
Yeah. So the vocabulary is one, I mean, less of an emphasis on democratic values, right? So broader sort of democracy versus autocracy, liberalism versus authoritarianism, and just looking at the rules of the metaphorical sort of like day-to-day behavior that makes the international system function. It's a very minuscule difference, but still a somewhat meaningful one, and a one that moves away from the framing of autocracy versus democracy, authoritarianism versus liberalism, et cetera, to this is how the world has worked most recently, and diverging from that just is not good for everyone else, versus we need to uphold small L liberalism, small L democracy, that sort of thing, right? So I think that that's an interesting sort of aspect of not only what the United States has just done in Venezuela, which has not been done with congressional approval, and all these whole other issues are massive legal sort of battles that could come down within the United States itself, but also, how that would relate to any sort of Chinese action towards Taiwan and how like-minded partners have reacted to it in the last few weeks before everything has happened in Venezuela.
Conversely, we are not necessarily thinking that the US actions in Venezuela are necessarily good for Taiwan, because then we hear it's a minority, but we hear some comments also saying, oh, it's good, it's a blow to China. It's even some people commenting that the Chinese equipment used by Venezuela failed, so it's good for Taiwan. Is that really true, though? Can we challenge this idea? To which extent is it true, or to which extent? I mean, there's been conversely some comments saying that the Chinese equipment may also have been mishandled by the Venezuelans, that it's not necessarily having a positive influence on Taiwan. So let's see, what is your opinion on that? When you hear people saying that what happens in Venezuela is actually good for Taiwan, do we challenge it, or to which extent do we concur?
So the way that I would respond to that would be to put my analysis hat on and say that we need to know more information about everything that's come out with the operation. There's been a plethora of different things available in terms of open source intelligence online on different platforms, from X, formerly known as Twitter, to other sort of platforms around tracking what that operation was like happening in real time. And when it comes to everything from suppression of air defenses, right, which has direct implications for Taiwan's own ability to be able to defend itself, if it were to face a massive raid, or any sort of contingency involving that same similar number of sorties, but maybe in a different sort of situation, right? It's not entirely clear to me if we actually have a clear answer about it. And I do think it's a little bit premature to say that this is automatically a good thing. It shows that Chinese military equipment isn't in the best position. We had a similar discourse like this with what happened with India and Pakistan over the summer related to the Mirage 2000 and Chinese fighter jets. Unfortunately, it becomes a part of disinformation, misinformation. It's easy to sort of get awash in that. But I do think we're going to need weeks, potentially months, to even fully grasp that from an open source perspective, how the operation sort of unfolded in real time. And it's worth mentioning that the PLA will be doing their own sort of reviews of what's happening with that, as they've done with American operations since the end of the Cold War, especially under the concept of revolution of military affairs.
Yes, exactly. When you mention Pakistan, that's exactly on point, because we were hearing exactly the opposite when Pakistan used Chinese weaponry, and now we hear some commentators saying, "Well, you see, what was said about Pakistan was disinformation." So on one hand, we hear Chinese equipment was wonderful; on the other hand, Chinese equipment was worthless. So the truth is probably somewhere in between. Aurelio, would you like to comment on this also?
Yeah, once again, I agree with Bryce in the sense that the reality is that many entrepreneurs in the media space feel compelled to have interesting narratives and to somehow connecting the threads between what happens in one theater and what happens into another. The reality is that we need to know more. So if we, for example, think about the possibility of part of the Chavista regime actually discarding Maduro to allow Delcy Rodriguez to take control of the presidency, then one we have to question ourselves to what extent certain complex military analysis of the effectiveness of Chinese military materiel are actually meaningful. And one has to take into consideration the enormous difference at an operational level between the operation in Venezuela and the operation in Taiwan. So once again, here we see how it's their own dynamic of the media market that actually spin and shape narratives that are not particularly useful to improve, to enhance understanding of Taiwan security and of cross-strait relations. And I think it's very, very relevant, the fact that I mentioned earlier about Chinese about the debate about the effectiveness of Chinese jets during the brief conflict between Pakistan and India, because also there's been, I know for a fact that there have been Indian contacts with Taiwanese authorities about these issues, where Indian authorities were actually discussing the Chinese information operations regarding the supposed effectiveness of Chinese jets operated by the Pakistani Air Force. And so again, we see how easily the events in Venezuela, but beyond Venezuela, spill over into the information domain of the cross-strait tensions that we see since 2016.
And it's Interesting. We're trying to do exactly the opposite with this program and try to counter all these narratives. So we find ourselves here going from the facts to the way they are treated and discussing it. So this begs the question, why? Why is everybody saying this? Why do we hear so many people, not only just a lot of noise online, but even people who are supposed to be serious commentators or serious editors? Why are all these people there speculating about this and spreading these messages, even though it took you guys 20 minutes to dismantle it?
So I'm happy to go first, and I just want to agree with the comments that Aurelio made as well towards the end, and also highlight the importance of not only thinking about the actual operation itself, but also the potential misuse for disinformation, misinformation around what has happened, and how that could sort of be, fed into Taiwan's media ecosystem as well, and also the sort of plethora of NGOs, nonprofits, and other organizations that Taiwan has to sort of combat that. So I think it's important to give a spotlight to that. I think the narrative sort of like feeds into itself for multiple reasons, right? I mean, Taiwan obviously is so central to the global economy, and whatever could happen to Taiwan in terms of any contingency would have a far more reaching effect on the world in general in terms of technology, trade, a whole host of issues, in ways that the war in Ukraine so far hasn't, with the exception of food and obviously, making sure that larger countries don't try to attack or subsume smaller countries, right? And unfortunately, recent U.S. actions in Venezuela do harm some of those arguments as well. But I do think it's important to remember, too, in the context of Taiwan, that the reason why it felt so visceral for many people here is, I mean, in theory, that could be a similar contingency with Taipei, right? So if you go ahead and you look back at Hangguang over the summer of last year, as Taiwan was doing its own more realistic exercises to prepare for defense in depth related to a Taiwan defense scenario or similar sort of issues. For example, I was staying in Kaohsiung during part of that exercise. There was a baseball diamond not too far away from where I was staying that had a ROC Army platoon that was stationed there. And talking to a classmate of mine who was a military officer here, pointed out to me that part of the reason why they would have taken over that stadium in their guesstimation during the exercise is to prevent, the insertion of PLA special forces on that baseball diamond itself, right? And some of the lessons that you would find from what happened in Venezuela would be very circumstantial to understanding how you could do that, right? The intelligence that needed to be collected for months to be able to build up a pattern of life on the Maduros themselves and other people that are high up within the Venezuelan government is no different than some of the issues we've had with Chinese intelligence in Taiwan in recent years, including that aid that was within President Lai's personal circle. So a lot of these things have direct implications. I think there is obviously smoke where there's fire, but I also think it's important to sort of step back, really think about what are the broader implications of this for Taiwan and how does this actually manifest, and also remembering that, it would be a little bit more or not a little bit more, but more difficult for Taiwan to sort of have its like air defenses overwhelmed in the same way. You would probably need a lot more missiles. Taiwan has a very sophisticated air defense network that's probably a lot closer to Israel in many ways than I think people might want to give it credit for. Maybe not in certain ways. So I think that that's what you need to step back and remember. I think that's why a lot of individuals and a lot of commentators feel that it makes sense to go ahead and draw many of those similar lessons. And I don't think it's a bad thing to do that. I just think it's important to put that in the right context where it actually could have real ramifications and do so in a way that just isn't panic inducing.
From a perspective of a European-based researcher rather than Bryce, who's based on Taiwan, and so he has an even more powerful argument from the Taiwanese side. But from the European side, I would argue that there is a specific, for European, but I would say also from a broader Western perspective, the issue here is a gap between the topicality of Taiwan within international politics and the actual expertise. And it is something absolutely relevant because the reality is that even beyond legacy media and generalist media, most of the people who somehow are contacted by media to talk about Taiwan, even researchers within think tanks or academia, are first and foremost China specialists. There is a gap in Taiwan knowledge within researchers, even within academia. There is a gap in experts on China who has a focus on cross-strait relations. And this gap then has an impact in the production of knowledge and dissemination of knowledge over Taiwan. So there is this tension between the fact that now if you cover international affairs, somehow you need to talk about Taiwan. But there is still a gap in the way in which media and the public debate is articulated over an extremely complex issue. That's another fundamental point, because every international politics issue from Sudan to Myanmar to Taiwan is particularly complex. But in the Taiwanese case, there are legal nuances, historical nuances that are constantly manipulated on the information within the information domain at the global level. There is a deep-rooted ignorance even on the basics of the fact of the historical realities of cross-strait relations and of Taiwan's current security environment. And this creates this kind of distortions that we mentioned earlier. It's good that Taiwan is talked about it, of course, but especially considering its relative diplomatic isolation. But at the same time, there is always the risk of the negative impact of this kind of distortions that emerge in the global debate.
Now, to finish on the topic on the way this information is treated, how could we initiate a change to make sure that there is more knowledge, how we close the gap that Aurelio was talking about?
Money, I would say. That's the reality of it. And it's a very complex issue, but the answer ultimately is money, in the sense that it's fundamental to fund knowledge about Taiwan within academia, to fund programs within think tanks and NGOs that allow the education of experts on Taiwan and on China's cross-strait policy. It's a very niche expertise that it can't be improvised over the day. The reality is that much of the debate, even among specialists, is a debate among China specialists who have to somehow deal with Taiwan. And this, of course, is, the answer, as I mentioned earlier, there is a straight answer that it's easy, it's money, but of course it's very difficult to try to find these fundings and then to articulate these fundings within institutions in Europe, in the United States, and beyond. It's fostering expertise, non-partisan expertise. I think that's also the tricky part. Fostering non-partisan expertise on these issues is difficult, but it would be the way to have educated, a way to create a community that could be useful, let's put it in these terms, in a public debate over Taiwan. But also at the same time, I wouldn't overestimate the real world impact of this community in some way, in the sense that we also have to take into consideration how difficult it is to articulate these debates at the global level. There is, I would argue, already quite an expertise even available to everyone on Ukraine, on the complexities of Ukraine history, on the roots of the conflict. But in the public domain, in the public debate, within social media, within all public spaces, it's so easily sidestepped and ignored. So this has to do with, I'd say, more deeply rooted problems within liberal democracies, in which information is now consumed, is being debated, and so there is no easy solution. There isn't a silver arrow.
Yeah, I think on my end, or at least within Taiwan domestically, I think that continuing to be more vocal and broadcasting about military defense exercises is important. So Taiwan, in addition to doing Hangguang, has also had several other exercises that involved being out and about, encountering people in their day-to-day lives, showing that Taiwan does have a resolution, or rather have the ability to sort of combat some of these potential sort of things that could, happen if there is a contingency, right? And not freak out the public. I think that that's like a key part. I also think that also means just broader sort of civil military outreach, continue to do the civil military sort of like civil defense outreach that the Biden administration has sort of put a premium on. And I also think a big part of that too is, as was alluded to earlier by Aurelio, it was in emphasizing that Taiwan does continue to educate as many folks as they can about the importance of cross-strait relations. What does that mean? What does the military balance mean? And what have you. As Aurelio put very, very succinctly, Taiwan is just a hot button issue, not only in Europe, but everywhere, right? From the United States to other places. Anytime you mention someone that you've been to Taiwan, you were just there, you're living there, you always get some remarks about how, it must be so dangerous. You might not have enough time to be here, that sort of thing, right? And that's not necessarily true. We can't really truly predict the future in that sort of sense. But I think it's important for Taiwan to continue to sort of talk about its own story, do so in a way that, highlights that it's a liberal democracy and diversity of voices here, because not every voice is going to agree, even though today we mostly agree on everything, or for the most part, things here. But also making sure that Taiwan understands that by signaling that it is prepared for a scenario like this, that also does invite, bringing on more partners that could help it out, not necessarily defend the island itself in the same way that the United States could or may not in an actual conflict, but capacity building, like working closely with other, partners across the Indo-Pacific, European partners, and other countries that you might not think of or might not come to mind necessarily, that could help build up capacity that make it easier for Taiwan to defend itself from an actual decapitation raid or strike like what we saw in Caracas, over the weekend.
So we are now touching, yes, on the final question, which is just how strong Taiwan is, because we also made the point that Taiwan is not the Maduro regime; it is much stronger than that. So, what are your insights on this? Just how strong is Taiwan? Just how capable Taiwan is to protect itself against such an operation?
So if you look at some of the more recent war games that have come out in the last few years, most notably, there was a war game report that CSIS in the United States put out a couple years ago, I believe. It was either 2024, I forget exactly when, but they did like a scenario of having a large number of, invasion, full-scale invasion, strong emphasis, scenarios that they planned for. And I think 65% of the time, Taiwan was able to, not at minimum, be able to sink or neutralize the majority of Chinese aircraft or maritime lift that would be needed to, ferry forces over to invade the island. It's also important to remember too that Taiwan has a very sophisticated air defense system. We don't fully have a good grasp on how advanced the PLA is in some of these different areas too. I think there's a tendency to overestimate what the PLA may or may not be, or at minimum, just be skeptical of some of our prior assumptions, right? So if you were sitting in the US government before the withdrawal from Afghanistan, some of the different estimates were talking about how Afghanistan could withhold for, months at a time or what have you. And Kabul, fell very quickly. Meanwhile, there were the inverse sort of estimates related to Kyiv, right? And Kyiv's ability to sort of withstand its own forces in the face of a Russian onslaught. And it's already 2026. I don't think we have a full understanding, at least in the United States. And I can't speak to Taiwan itself, but at least amongst Americans and the US government right now, what some of those PLA capabilities might look like and how does that actually fit together in terms of an actual scenario, not just bean counting. And I think that that's something to keep in the back of our mind as we sort of go forward and try to assess anything related to this.
Yes, to go back to what I mentioned earlier, here there is an issue of expertise, right? So I'm glad Bryce is here with us. I'm not a military analyst. That's something important. To go back to the point at which people may have, even researchers may have a very specific niche expertise on Taiwan and on cross-strait relations that not automatically would translate into an actual knowledge of military affairs. And so I defer to Bryce on this point, but what I could add are three very short points. The first one is that we don't know much about the PLA, and we need to take into consideration the inherently Leninist propagandist dynamic within the PLA, the way in which the PLA talks about its capabilities, disseminates its narratives are rooted in very historical Leninist ways in which information is manipulated. And so we need to take that into consideration. We don't know much about the PLA, and the PLA presents itself into a very specific way that somehow is often forgotten by Western media. I always find interesting how there is a Leninist dimension within the PRC that somehow could help us understand the country better if we try to remember what we learned about the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's not a strict analogy, but the PRC is a Leninist regime. And often we tend to forget. Not a Marxist regime. I'm not talking about, of course, that kind of system when it comes to ideology, but specifically about, from a bureaucratic level, about the country as a one-party state works and how it, because of its political system, manipulates information. And this is something that somehow we tend to forget. The other side of it is often we find on media discussions about very negative discussion, even recently about war games in the United States that point towards Chinese superiority. But in this case, systematically, we tend to forget the war games are inherently designed to focus on the worst case scenarios. This is something that is somehow lost on media because then it's a good title if you could put that the United States lose against China 20 times out of 20 in a war game. So to go back to what I mentioned earlier. And finally, the last point I wanted to make is about the focus not much on the military dimension, but on the political dimension within Taiwan. I think that beyond the specific issues about Taiwanese asymmetric, the development of Taiwanese asymmetric capabilities vis-a-vis the PRC, it's important to keep in mind whether Taiwan will be able to maintain a degree of political coherence at the domestic level and will avoid slipping into a system of fully dysfunctional politics. And this is I would say, is the first line of defense for Taiwan. And this is why we should focus also on what is defined in Taiwan as the cognitive warfare issue, on the impact of gray zone operations within the information domain in Taiwan, or what we in Europe call as hybrid threats. This is something very important in the sense that beyond the specific military dimension of the confrontation, there is, of course, a broader context within all the other domains, diplomatic, infrastructure, financial, the legal ones, and then spill over into the Taiwanese domestic politics. And the more China is able to influence the Taiwanese domestic politics and foster a climate of dysfunction within the Taiwan's politics, the less Taiwan would be resilient in case of a hostile takeover by Beijing.
Bryce and Aurelio, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again.
We often hear about 2027 being a deadline for Taiwan. A common shortcut by misinformed people is to claim there is a prediction that China will attack Taiwan in 2027. This is an overblown reaction to one single comment that was never even about a Chinese invasion in the first place. Let's talk to a few people about it.
My name is Joseph Tsai. I'm professor of political science at Zhongzheng University. Yeah, it's we call Davidson window because the beginning is on Admiral of Indo-PACOM. Davidson. He said 2027 would be a year for China to attack Taiwan. But the meaning is that is this the D-Day or it's just a deadline? Or it's just it's something like, okay, when you try to set a day and it's not a deadline, it's a benchmark. It's the year for preparation or for capabilities, something like that. They've been doing the intelligence for collecting the data from China, especially China has the biggest naval fleet in the world, right? In terms of the numbers. So for US, the concern is maybe in that year, China will have capabilities, especially we know amphibious landing abilities. So that kind of stuff. So I think it's very worrying, especially for Taiwan or for the United States.
This is all there is. One admiral called Davidson once said that based on the information he received, Xi Jinping wants the Chinese military to be a match for the US and gave them 2027 as a deadline for that. The rest is an extrapolation. Ronan Fu of Academia Sinica explains.
I do not think that 2027 is a precise estimate of the Chinese invasion of Taiwan timeline for a couple of reasons. Number one, 2027 has been cited, and the rationale behind 27 is simply that Xi Jinping asked the POA to get ready by this specific time. But getting something ready doesn't mean that you are going to do such a thing by this precise timeline. And to be more realistic, I don't think that POA will be ready for a full-fledged assault against Taiwan by 2027. Yeah, it's simply, not a feasible plan for at least two reasons. Number one, as long as the U.S. continue to provide arms and perhaps training and maybe some advice to Taiwan, and basically if Taiwan can continue to arm itself, then I don't think that actually taking over Taiwan is is a very easy task, even for POA. So 2027, basically is not possible, even if you only consider the problem of capabilities. But when it comes to what about, what's going to happen in 2050, then, we will be less confident about, being very optimistic that Taiwan won't be attacked because the entire calculation will be, vastly different. By 2050, you have to take into account, the limitation of US power projection. You also have to consider, for example, the amount of effort that China can actually put into building and boosting POS capabilities. So by 2050, we could actually be engaging with dealing with a different animal. But I just want to mention that 27, no way, not going to happen.
2027, because it will be a year before Taiwan 2028 presidential elections. So Beijing may feel that coercion is most effective during periods of political transitions. So, and during that time, on U.S. naval, especially the fleet size, is scaling down in the late 2020s, as a lot of old ships will be retired. So the thing is that it creates a temporary window of opportunity for China to attack Taiwan.
So it doesn't mean there will be a war over Taiwan next year. And the deadline goes both ways. Both Taiwan and its security partners are also sharpening their defenses in the meantime.
Basically, if I'm right, then it sort of provides Taiwan some, ample time and opportunity to actually make an invasion of Taiwan not a feasible plan for POA, regardless of the potential leadership transition in China, whether it's going to happen or not going to happen. If Taiwan can actually get ready for any contingency plans, then I think that Taiwan can actually secure security by working with the United States and also some other like-minded states.
But in the meantime, they try to say that kind of year it's a benchmark for Taiwan and United States as well, because this year is 2026, right? It's not U.S. and Taiwan still have time to get prepared, right? So it's like a two-way street. Maybe on the one hand, you focus on the exact year for China to get ready, but on the other hand, it's kind of like it's a very, very important year for Taiwan and the United States to get prepared as well. So I think sometimes we need to get close to friends and we must get closer to our enemy. That means we have to pay more attention to our enemy. And in the meantime, we have to work together. We have to be a team and sort of have a big alliance, including US, Japan, and the Philippines, to prevent against Chinese unprovoked attack to Taiwan. China has been using that kind of coercions or compellence against Taiwan. For example, just recently, they launched a military exercise, right? And the scale is getting not bigger, but the thing is that it's getting closer to Taiwan. So the threat is imminent. We cannot just say, "Oh, China's threat it's not imminent," but it can be deterred. The thing is, because in the meantime, we know the threat is coming. So we have to get prepared, because why did they use that kind of exercise? They try to intimidate Taiwan because Taiwan is developing a lot of asymmetric capabilities now, especially US just ratified a large scale of arms and weapons to Taiwan. You can see HIMARS missile systems, right? And in the meantime, Harpoon and also Javelin missile system, and also a lot of self-propelled howitzers, something like that. So Taiwan is building up our military capability. So it's maybe we are running out of time, but still we are getting stronger and stronger. So it can provide a very credible deterrence, especially for China, try to intimidate or try to attack Taiwan in the near future.
So why do we hear about 2027 so much? It boils down to how easy it is to spread a very simplified piece of information, even if it's not accurate. And it is dangerous for Taiwan if it gives a sense of doom, or as China likes to put it, of inevitability, instead of encouraging East Asian democracies to keep up the pace in their defense.
I guess it's a very easy argument to make, because if you want to sound, so for two reasons. Number one, if you want to sound very smart, they want to say, okay, so let's think about and let's try to engage the worst case scenario, right? So like 27 presents a very perfect, storm. Basically, you can say 2027 things will happen, so get ready by then. And even if you get it wrong, say nothing's gonna happen in 27, you can still make an argument that it's because when you actually send out a warning to Taiwan and to the international community, so we get ready. That's the reason why 27 we are not going to see anything happen. And secondly, the reason why a lot of people are trying to talk about a possibility of 2027 Chinese invasion is because a lot of countries actually they are in the process, or they have already tried very hard to securitize China, or I should say securitize China. Okay, so the basic idea is that we want to securitize China so that China will always portrayed as an imminent threat. And if you say 27, then China will be depicted as an imminent threat, compared to the narratives where you say, okay, so we still have some time to work on our defense. So now it's perhaps not 27, it's 2035 or 2050. right? And if you say 2020, if you say 2035 or 2050, then people won't necessarily take your word seriously. But if you say 2027, then even if you're wrong, then you are trying to create arguably like a sense of emergency, right? So like if we actually don't question their intention, then maybe just assume that they present good wells, then you could say that 27 maybe works if it can actually compel everybody to be on the same page, to acknowledge the urgency of the Taiwan situation. That's the only good thing that I can think of, like 2027. Otherwise, I want to make it very clear that 2027 is not a very precise estimation. It's flawed.
Yes, but people would read that kind of language, would say, oh, 2027 would be a D-Day, right? Because in that time, China would be ready, and it's because they try to say it's the year they can have that kind of capability. But the point is this the exact year, or this is just a benchmark? It's not a deadline. We don't have a crystal ball to predict, it's that year. But the thing is that because they try to estimate, in that time, China would be more capable. All right. So that's the goal here. It just give you some warnings and give you some heads up, so you can get prepared. So maybe it will be this year or next year. You never know, right? But sometimes just give you an idea, and then you can sort of pull your own weight. In the meantime, you have to pay attention to Taiwan's self-defense capabilities. This is very important. If you want to provide a credible deterrence, you need to set a day, and you need to get prepared. And it's like goal planning, right? You have to sort of, okay, this is the day. So before that, what can I do?
You don't want to actually use 2027 so that you become petrified, so that you do nothing. You want to use the war prospect, and you know that you still have time and space to arm yourself, to work with your security partners, so that you can actually make war like a scenario that will never that's never going to unfold, right? So get it ready so that you don't have war. If you say, okay, power symmetry, stop trying, then basically war is very, very, very close.
Other news around Taiwan this week. First, in Taipei, the opposition KMT and Taiwan People's Party have blocked the government's special defense budget for the sixth time. They demand higher pay for military personnel before approving the package. Second, Taiwan's 2025 exports hit a record high, driven by huge global demand for AI-related chips and electronics. Third, Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has condemned China's digital intimidation after Beijing announced plans to arrest legislator Puma Shen and doxed Shen and other Taiwanese figures involved in counter-disinformation work. We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.